In this presentation for the Carter-Jenkins Center in Tampa, Florida, I'll present my work on recognizing defenses in the drawings and play of children in therapy. It was originally published by the Educational Publishing Foundation of the American Psychological Association and can be found in print in the journal Psychoanalytic Psychology, Volume 22, Number 3, Summer 2005. Children's drawings and play have long been recognized as rich repositories of symbolic material derivative of infantile sexual fantasy. That view is based predominantly on the early drive theory approach to the interpretation of dreams, with an almost exclusive focus on symbolic content. In an effort to broaden the interpretive skills available to the child therapist, my presentation today places the content of children's drawings and play into the background and brings the defensive processes into higher relief. I'll address the defenses in children's play and even more so, the defenses in children's drawings. Without creating a simplistic formula, I'll offer examples of ways to recognize defenses in children's drawings and play based on observations from clinical practice. Defenses and defense mechanisms. When children in psychotherapy are invited to express themselves by playing with toys or drawing pictures, they reveal their deepest concerns in the metaphors of their imagination. While the content of these drawings is often revealing, the process is often concealing. In a strictly verbal therapy, the defenses enter the session as resistances to the invitation to free associate, and are, to a great extent, recognized as figures of speech and styles of speaking. In a play therapy, there is no fundamental rule, no invitation to free associate, only an invitation to play. Consequently, there is no resistance per se, only defense, which the therapist must interpret or at least manage. In The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense, Anna Freud contextualized her work by explaining that in the early days, psychoanalysis was a psychology of the id and was expected to, quote, confine its investigations exclusively to infantile fantasies carried on into adult life, imaginary gratifications, and the punishments apprehended in retribution for these. With the publication of Sigmund Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle in 1920, psychoanalysis expanded from a psychology of the id to a psychology of the ego and the id. Thus, Anna Freud explained the analyst's first task is to recognize the defense mechanism. Quote, his next task is to undo what has been done by the defense, to find out and restore to its place that which has been omitted through repression, to rectify displacements, and to bring that which has been isolated back into its true context. When he has reestablished the severed connections, he turns his attention once more from the analysis of the ego to that of the id. Elegant, I would say. Anna Freud reminded us that defenses help us to manage 1, the strength of the instincts, 2, objective anxiety, and 3, superego anxiety. She lists 9 defenses previously described in the literature: regression, repression, reaction formation, isolation, undoing, projection, introjection, turning against the self, and reversal. To these 9, she adds sublimation. These 10 are the defenses available to the ego in its conflicts with the instinctual representatives and their affects. In the ego's conflicts with objective unpleasure and objective danger, she says the ego employs denial in fantasy, denial in word and act, and restriction of the ego. In the ego's conflicts with the superego anxiety, she lists identification with the aggressor and a form of altruism. Subsequently, Arthur Wallenstein and his co-workers formulated a list of 24 first-order defensive activities and 15 additional complex second-order defensive activities. I put the list here on the wall, but won't read each of these first and second-order defenses that Wallenstein and his group, under the authorship of Biebring et al., published back in 1961. Robert Wallerstein then drew a distinction between defense mechanisms as constructs that denote a way of functioning of the mind, invoked to explain how behaviors, affects, and ideas serve to avert or modulate unwanted impulse discharge, and defenses as the actual behaviors, affects, and ideas which serve defensive purposes. This was a very important basic distinction in terms of clearing up the confusion between a defense mechanism and a defense. He further noted that they can both be of varying levels of hierarchical complexity, and so Wallenstein's differentiation between first and second order defensive activities seemed to break down. Subsequently, Paulina Kernberg identified 31 defense mechanisms which she subdivided into normal, neurotic, borderline, and psychotic groupings. While such hierarchies are useful, we must bear in mind the limits of such schemas and recognize that defenses of one sort or another may be identified in the behavior of a wide variety of people with different levels of personality organization. As such, in addition to identifying defensive strategies, we must also be attentive to the predominance of certain defenses, the constellations of defenses, the effectiveness and flexibility of those defenses, and the threats which they defend against. Anna Freud noted that in analysis, the uninterrupted flow of associations illuminate the contents of the id, while the resistances reveal the defenses. She cautioned against the lopsided approaches of, on the one hand, simply dealing with free associations, latent dream thoughts, symbols, and the contents of the transference, or on the other hand, simply dealing with the resistances, dream censorship, and various transferred modes of defense. Subsequently, Merton Gill discussed the hierarchical complexity of defenses, noted that any behavior simultaneously has impulse and defense aspects, and that defensive behavior will provide some discharge of what is being defended against. Furthermore, Roy Schaefer said that defenses must be viewed as expressing the unity of the ego and the id, and not just the division and enmity of the two. Anna Freud had said something similar when she recognized that various measures of defense are not entirely the work of the ego, but are partially formed by the properties of the instincts. Nonetheless, Gill and Schaefer were emphatic on this point and extended it to a completely different level. In Paulina Kernberg's summary of the British school's contributions to the concept of mechanisms of defense, she included 1, their proposals that impulses, feelings, and modes of defense are experienced as fantasies. 2, the observation that defense mechanisms defend and, quote, promote the gratification of instincts and serve growth and development, unquote. And 3, the complex relationship of instinct to fantasy and defense mechanisms. Thus, the defense reveals as it conceals. In other words, the size of the lock on the vault tells us something about that which is contained within, or at least how it is valued. By observing the style of the narrative, the drawings, and the play, the therapist recognizes the defenses being employed and their relation to the instincts and other threats. Defenses cover and invite us to discover. As Schaeffer pointed out, defenses are not simply wardings off, renunciations and negative assertions. They are also implementations, gratifications, and positive assertions. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about recognizing defenses in children's play. In 1915, Sigmund Freud made a play observation of his 18-month-old grandson. Freud wrote, and I quote, by the way, the picture you see here is a picture of Sigmund Freud with his two of his grandchildren, Heinerli and Ernst. Ernst is the one on Freud on the right. You see, not sitting in Freud's lap, but holding onto his arm. This is the child better known as the child of Fort Da, the Fort Da baby. Freud wrote in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, "The child had a wooden reel with a piece of string tied round it. It never occurred to him to pull it along the floor behind him, for instance, and play at its being a carriage. What he did was to hold the reel by a string and very skillfully throw it over the edge of his curtained cot so that it disappeared into it, at the same time uttering an expressive, 'Oh!' He then pulled the reel out of the cot again by the string and hailed its reappearance with a joyful, 'Da!' This then was the complete game, disappearance and return. Freud wrote that based on the context of the game, it was clear to him and the child's mother that the 'oh' that this child uttered when the reel was thrown over the edge of the cot was his way of saying 'fort,' the German word for gone, and that when he said 'da,' it was the German word for there. Freud then made the interpretation that this game of disappearance and return, this game of fort, da, gone, and there, quote, was related to the child's great cultural achievement, the instinctual renunciation, that is, the renunciation of instinctual satisfaction, which he had made in allowing his mother to go away without protesting. What happened is this boy was playing this game whenever his mother left the room, left the apartment. He compensated himself for this, as it were, by himself staging the disappearance and return of the objects within his reach. The child cannot possibly have felt his mother's departure as something agreeable or even indifferent. How then does his repetition of this distressing experience as a game fit in with the pleasure principle? Freud was asking. Continuing the Freud quote, "It may perhaps be said in reply that her departure from the apartment had to be enacted as a necessary preliminary to her joyful return, and that it was in the latter that lay the true purpose of the game. But against this must be counted the observed fact that the first act, that of departure, was staged as a game in itself and far more frequently than the episode in its entirety, with its pleasurable ending." Freud suggests two interpretations. The first is that the child was in a passive position in relation to his mother's departure. Thus, the game offered him an active role and might suggest an instinct for mastery, acting independent of the pleasure associated. The second interpretation was that throwing away the object might provide a pleasurable yield by satisfying an impulse to turn the tables and take revenge on his mother for leaving him, as if to say, and again I quote Freud, "All right then, go away. I don't need you. I'm sending you away myself," unquote. In offering the second interpretation, Freud helped us to understand the tendency to repeat scenarios in life that are seemingly unpleasant, but are reenacted because they are familiar, that is, shaped by and derived from early experiences in the family. He further demonstrated how this compulsion to repeat is the cornerstone of neurotic behavior. In his observation of the Fort Da game, Freud recognized a defensive strategy in play when his grandson symbolized his mother, projected her into the wooden reel, and turned passive into active to come to terms with the threat of abandonment. Anna Freud wrote, "If we analyze the interruption of play, we discover that it represents a defensive measure on the part of the ego comparable to resistance in free association." Erik Erikson later defined play disruption as the sudden and complete or diffused and slowly spreading inability to play. The inability to play may be due to a number of specific defensive maneuvers, including suppression, ego restriction, and repression. But sometimes the play continues, while at the same time maintaining a variety of defensive maneuvers. Of course, sublimation, displacement, and turning passive into active are three very important defensive maneuvers that are integral to almost all imaginative play. Doing and undoing is seen in a variety of commonly observed play scenes involving repetitious scenarios and themes of death and rebirth. Fort Da, hide and seek, peekaboo, things of this sort. Anxieties about freely giving oneself over to the play, that is, anxieties about regressing in the service of the ego, are seen in the lining up of figures in efforts to create games with rigidly fixed rules and other manifestations of ego restriction. Acting out becomes obvious when the pretend status of the play is lost and the child's impulses seek direct gratification in actions that stop the imaginative play and become dangerous, destructive, or inappropriate. Lily Peller described the development of play from the infant's solitary body play to play with toys or the body in relation to the mother, to creative and imaginative play with toys in parallel with and then together with peers, and on to games. In addition to providing us with a developmental schema of play, Peller also gave us a tool for recognizing when a child starts to use regression as a defense. Thus, regression could be seen not only in the appearance of infantile playthings, but also in any shift in the entire play mode to earlier forms of play for that particular child. Depressive play themes reflecting a turning against the self may include destroying play scenes, dropping toys, and an absence of imaginative play. The therapist's invitation to regress in the service of the ego may also be defended against by the use of rationalization, as revealed in a preference for realistic figures, themes, and scenarios. The following is a list of some popular children's games and a partial list of dominant defensive strategies mobilized in playing these games. Games like Fort Da, peekaboo, and hide and seek, for example, pertain to a child's sense of emotional object constancy, as well as the anxieties associated with damage and repair, loss and return. As such, they fortify the ego by practicing at doing and undoing and turning passive into active. Games of catch and chase contain some similar components. Games like Tag You're It, Cops and Robbers, and Running from the One with Cooties are built on the defensive operations of projection and identification with the bad object. Contests, Trials of Strength, and King of the Mountain provide a wonderful expression of Oedipal rivalry and an opportunity for identification with the aggressor, and again turning passive into active. Dress Up is another obvious game of identification. Simon Says and Follow the Leader address the sadomasochistic dynamics of dominance and submission through identification with the aggressor, turning passive into active, suppression of impulses, etc. When children run, play cars, and chase, manic defenses, such as avoidance, are mobilized and practiced. Building sand castles, painting and playing with modeling clay all require regression in the service of the ego, sublimation, and the use of fantasy. Playing house and playing doctor also require regression in the service of the ego, sublimation, and the use of fantasy. But turning passive into active is also an essential defensive strategy employed in these games. Children that like to make collections, stamps, seashells, butterflies, thimbles, etc., may be employing a number of different defensive strategies at the same time, such as rationalization, displacement, turning passive into active, identification, etc. When children watch and play magic, we often recognize their fears of castration and the reparative fantasy of the female phallus. Now you see it, now you don't. The woman who is cut in half and put back together. The wand that is broken and then made anew. The disappearing rabbit that comes out of the hat. The magic wand and the mysteries of levitation without using the hands. Magical thinking links faulty or partial information concerning the differences between the sexes, common to childhood experience. But when magical thinking becomes a style after secondary process thinking has been established, it may serve as a link that maintains a split or a gap, and in this way wards off anxiety related to the knowledge of sexual difference. Now I'd like to talk with you in more depth about recognizing defenses in children's drawings. As we now consider defenses in children's drawings, it behooves us to recall that defenses are those strategies that are used to defend against the instincts, objective anxiety, and superego anxiety. In the case of little Hans, Sigmund Freud described the development of symptoms and the treatment of a 5-year-old boy who had developed a phobia of horses. The boy was the son of Max Graf, a member of Freud's Psychological Wednesday Society. Within Freud's account of the world's first child analysis, he wrote, quote, "His father luckily made a note of many things which turned out later on to be of unexpected value." And this is Max Graf had written down. "I drew a giraffe for Hans, who has been to Schönbrunn several times lately." Schönbrunn had a zoo. "He said to me, 'Draw its wiggler, too,' its penis." And Max Graf said, "Draw it yourself," I answered, whereupon he added this line to my picture. He began by drawing a short stroke and then added a bit onto it, remarking, "Its wiggler is longer." The actual drawing of the giraffe and its wiggler, its penis, is reproduced in Freud's account of the case, so we can see what they were specifically talking about and even how the final drawing came to be. Now, I have played with the drawing a little bit to show you what the first drawing looked like, how little Hans added the line to it, and then how he extended it. Okay, so that was my playing with the image that you will find in Freud's collected works in the story of the case of little Hans. First, his father drew a picture of the giraffe, and there you see the giraffe. Then little Hans added a short line to represent its wiggler, its penis. And then finally, he extends the line saying its wiggler is longer. Okay, and this is how you're going to see it reproduced in the collected works of Sigmund Freud. The short line of the giraffe's wiggler and its subsequent elongation are graphically separate from the body of the giraffe. We could ask, was little Hans' intense interest in the horse's whittler and the giraffe's whittler counterphobic? Why has he drawn the giraffe's whittler graphically disconnected or cut from the giraffe's body? Are we talking about castration and or denial? Was the first line of the whittler drawn as a minimization of the giraffe's penis, his father's penis? Or was it an accurate representation of Hans's own diminutive penis, about which he had become anxious? Was the second line of the whittler drawn as a reaction formation to what may have been perceived as a small penis, his own, or an accurate representation of his father's penis, about which Hans also had some anxiety? While speculations about the answers to these questions could form the basis of another discussion, the anecdote itself and the questions I propose provide us with a historical context and an orientation to our discussion about recognizing defenses in children's drawings. As with symbolism, a discussion about recognizing defenses in children's drawings must begin with a statement about the importance of not using the following observations like a simple formula or decoding book in which this equals that. The aim here is not to present a decoding tool as much as it is to offer some general observations gathered from clinical experience that the reader can bear in mind while sitting with child patients expressing themselves through drawing. Though I assume that the following observations might be applicable to drawings drawn in other contexts, it must be noted that clinically, I generally use a non-directive approach in my invitation for children to drawing therapy. My office contains small toys, a sand tray, puppets, clay, paper, crayons, and pencils. I invite the child to draw whatever he or she would like to draw, and only coax enough to get the process started. During or after the completion of the drawing, I like to engage the child in a discussion about the drawing and invite him or her to tell me a story about it. I take dictation and write the story down verbatim. This often engages the two of us more deeply into a discussion about the picture, and it not infrequently has the effect of stimulating the child to become more interested in elaborating the story and delighting in hearing the story retold at the end of the session. When interpretations are made, I generally make them, at least to begin with, within the metaphor of the play, the drawing, or the story. The stories the children tell not only elaborate the content of their fantasies, but the defenses come into higher relief as well. Interpretations within the metaphor allows for an elaboration of the content, and to a certain extent, a demonstration of the defenses, which can then be interpreted or managed in such a way as to allow the further elaboration of the fantasy. Ernst Chris wrote, quote, "When the artist creates during inspiration, he is subject to an ego regression, but it is a partial and temporary ego regression, one controlled by the ego which retains the function of establishing contact with an audience." Unquote. The drawings of schizophrenics, however, are characterized by, and I quote him again, he and Oppenheim, the tendency to fill space, to crowd in, the stereotypy and the rigidity of all shapes, and the hypertrophy of symbols. By his word, the insane artist commands the demons, and by his image, he exercises magic control. Art has deteriorated from communication to sorcery, unquote. Thus, the path from sorcery to communication is characterized by the exchange and refinement of lower-order defenses for higher-order defenses. Margaret Naumburg described the progression from rigid and stereotyped drawings at the beginning of therapy to those at the end of treatment, which were characterized as being more personal, original, and spontaneous. Edith Kramer described the typical defensive strategies in children's drawings as stereotyped figures, repetition, and chaos. Scribbles by children capable of representational drawing, perfectionism, abstract art, designs, explosions, conventional representations, copying, tracing, and the like. She noted that the progression from acting out to sublimation is not always possible during the course of a therapy, and that more modest goals of exchanging chaotic acting out with only slightly higher order defenses can make a significant difference in the life of a child. As an example, she noted, quote, "In his better moments, Henry manufactured innumerable Stars of David, initials or combinations of both, and gave them away as presents. Although the activity was compulsive and stereotyped, it helped him behave in a less chaotic fashion, cement relationships, and establish some tenuous feelings of identity." Unquote. Most of the literature on children's drawings addresses the meaning of the content. When defenses are addressed, they are usually described in terms of the restriction of the ego, sublimation, and regression in the service of the ego. Often in the literature on projected drawings, for example, Coppets, graphic indicators are associated directly with certain kinds of emotional problems, without reference to defenses. While therapists may, in a sense, naturally interpret or manage the defenses, while more consciously tracking and addressing the drive derivatives, my presentation today endeavors to widen our point of view by helping the child therapist to more consciously recognize the defenses. The following is an account of a variety of defenses and their graphic indicators and/or other behavioral indicators associated with children's drawings. Once again, defenses are behaviors for avoiding or modulating the strength of the instincts, objective anxiety, and superego anxiety. As resistances in verbal therapies, many defenses appear as manifestations in speech, intellectualization, rationalization, humor, negation, etc. The verbal therapies canalize the psyche, if you will, into language, and in doing so, support verbalization and reflection over acting out and other symptomatic behaviors. On the other hand, the dangers of getting caught in the quagmires of intellectualization and rationalization are familiar to all psychotherapists working in the verbal modalities. Similarly, a therapy that canalizes the psyche partially into drawings and play supports sublimation, regression in the service of the ego, and to a certain extent, acting out. Acting out is one of those annoying demons that slips out of Pandora's box when we invite the child not simply to talk with us, but to engage the motor system as well, by playing with toys, crawling about the office, and drawing. Child therapists are not strangers to toys flying across their offices. Unexpected punches, unexpected hugs, broken crayons, clay in the rug, and drawings that spill over onto desks and floors. These are common clinical problems that every child therapist must find a way to deal with technically by interpreting the acting out, canalizing the acting out into sublimated activity, limiting the media available, and in some cases, practicing self-defense. To begin with, the refusal to draw may reflect a fear of the impulses emerging uncontrollably, which are warded off with suppression or avoidance. The conscious effort to not be aware of something that has already entered consciousness. We see suppression in the child's comment, "I don't want to draw." But in more cases than not, the refusal to draw is born of superego anxiety projected onto the therapist. Projection is the displacement and relocation of the person's thoughts, feelings, desires, etc. into others or the outer world. Projection is commonly used defensive strategy, but when overused, it manifests as a paranoid stance. This paranoid stance was demonstrated by an 8-year-old boy who was content to draw as long as I didn't watch. But when I did, he stopped drawing, glared at me, and said, "What are you looking at?" Restriction of the ego is a limiting of activity to avoid threatening and overwhelming external stimuli. We may recognize it in a constriction and repetition of forms and themes. An autistic boy from age 9 to 14 drew circles that changed only slightly during the course of our work together. The forms changed from scribbles to discs to suns with radials to hollow circles, and finally to hollow circles with a line off to the side. His 1,250 drawings drawn during the course of 5 years are so similar that they were used to make a 5-minute film, a virtual animation depicting the tiny changes in his psyche as reflected in his drawings. While the changes corresponded with changes in his functioning, these images reflect, more than anything, a severe autistic restriction of the ego. I would now like to show you all 1,250 drawings drawn by this autistic child during a period of 5 years. Starts with some scribbles, turns to some circles, then we begin to see some suns emerging. After a while, you'll begin to see some much more intense forms in the middle that actually and become differentiated and almost look like reflections or images of an emerging face, after which the rays will fall off shortly. Here you see some inner details. When the rays fall off, we have this hollowed out circle. At this point, the boy became completely echolalic. Up to that point, he did have some speech, but it was a very strange, autistic speech, and not always terribly communicative. But at this point in his development, he was fully echolalic, and was for the remainder of the time I made him. There you see the line off to the side emerging. And there you go. Okay, so here you have a sample of these 1,250 drawings, one picture from each month during this investigation. I think that would be the best word for it. What he said about these circles was that each one he called a mouth. And he certainly knew what a mouth was. But as I said, he used speech in a very strange sort of way. And but the image of the mouth became the basis of another study. But the main point I want to demonstrate here in this lecture is his extraordinary restriction of the ego, an autistic restriction of the ego, as demonstrated in these 1,250 drawings. A restriction of the ego was also evident in the drawings of a 7-year-old boy who was violent and attending a school for disturbed children. He drew monsters and vacation scenes. What was uncanny was the occasional recreation of a scene that he had previously drawn, in colors that were identical and with placement so similar to the previous drawing that one could place one picture on top of the other, hold them up to the light, and see the features of both pictures in the exact same positions. Another kind of a rigidity I'm describing here. Though I've only seen a few cases like this, the experience sensitized me to children's use of space in their drawings. Since then, I've often placed two drawings from the same child, one on top of the other, and not infrequently found that the father in one picture, for example, is in the same place as the monster in the next picture. Now, what I'd like to show you here is a picture that was drawn by this boy on February 27th, and then we see here on the next day, he did this picture. Now, he did not have the previous picture in front of him. He wasn't trying to copy it or anything like that. Both pictures were invitations for free drawings. In the next picture, we're going to see the two drawings, one placed directly on top of the other. And you can see the placement, the colors, and the specific animals, the trees, the suns are lined up exactly, or awfully close to it. Here we see a picture of a cheetah chasing a deer. Again, I'm not talking about the symbolic content of the cheetah chasing the deer, or the symbolic content of the dinosaurs, as much as how he's using his imagery and how he's using it in a very rigid sort of way. We see here a cheetah chasing a deer with trees on either side, the clouds, the sky, and the sun. This is on March 1st. Here's one on March 4th. When we put the two together, we get this image. Okay. And here we have this picture that was done on January 31st. It's a boat going underneath a bridge with some people on it and some trees off to the side and the sun up in the corner. And then fully 2 months later, March 25th, he does this picture of a boat. And it looks like we've got some fish over jumping out of the water there on the side. We put the two together. And then we have the boats in the exact same place. Bridge in the exact same place. People lined up in the same area. The restriction of the ego may also be evident in children's preferences for stick figures, the use of pencil or pen instead of color crayons, or the use of a single color instead of the whole spectrum. Stiff-looking human forms, and barren scenes also convey a restriction of the ego. While the restriction of the ego can be recognized in the extreme, rigid repetition of form, color, placement, style, and themes, a more flexible repetition of forms and themes is routinely encountered in almost any series of drawings executed by a child in psychotherapy. When the forms and themes recur with some flexibility, they simply represent manifestations of the repetition compulsion, and perhaps a good therapeutic process as well. An example of this was the case of a child who for many months drew pictures and told stories about two friends who were fixing the bicycle of one of the two boys. A sweet commentary on the transference and the therapeutic process. Restriction of the ego is a warding off of threatening external stimuli by limiting activity and inhibition in a similar strategy, but used to ward off internal stimuli. So we have restriction of the ego to ward off external stimuli and inhibition to ward off internal stimuli. Recognizing them as defenses in drawings is not always as clear as their definitions, though. What we have here is a sketch of Hermione Hoog-Helmuth. She's the originator of play therapy, and she wrote the first book on child analysis. It was called A Study of the Mental Life of the Child. In this book, she reported numerous child observations of her nephew patient, Rolf. In one passage, she reported, quote, "Very proper drawings have come even from the hand of my nephew, who has won for himself, I fear, a bad reputation through the pages of this book. Trains of cars without a water closet, but with an enormous smoke funnel and a great quantity of smoke streaming from it. Street lamps with lamplighter and ladder, as they are seen in picture books, beetles and butterflies without sex characteristics," unquote. The properness of drawings and the absence of toilets and sex characteristics are, of course, another kind of restriction of the ego or inhibition. We find that some children will not only confine themselves to pencil-drawn stick figures, but will also prefer to draw their pictures using templates, a ruler, or a compass. The restriction of the ego, or inhibition, are obvious, but the preference for perfection in these pictures is often secondarily associated with intellectualization, the use of directed intellectual activity as a means of controlling affects and impulses. Intellectualization is also evident in the preference for minute detail as well as in the representation of maps, diagrams, non-pictorial patterns, or abstract representations. Representations of objects placed in the center of the page without backgrounds present a timeless, placeless, and socially disconnected statement of being. When the narcissism, intellectualization, isolation, and abstraction are more intense, we see centrally placed abstract images and designs, some of which have philosophical, political, or cosmic meanings consciously attributed to them, as seen in the case of Richard, reported by Melanie Klein in 1945. Richard spoke of his abstract designs as representing relationships between political forces, but with the help of his analyst, he was eventually able to understand those political forces as being more related to personal concerns. Isolation is an effort to ward off unpleasant stimuli by distancing oneself from them or by isolating affects from ideas. Abstraction is a kind of intellectualization in which the focus is not on the troublesome affect-laden reality of the problem, but on the concepts and patterns of life. Isolation can be expressed in a refusal to draw, a difficulty beginning a drawing, a pencil that reliably shakes before touching the paper, and a light or sketchy line that is used to draw the picture. It can also be reflected in the isolated or central placement of a person, object, or abstract form. Related to isolation is withdrawal of affect, which can be seen in some monochromatic drawings, preference for pencil drawings, and forms that are not filled in with color or shading. Depersonalizing can be recognized in an absence of human or any other animate form and a preference for robotic figures or abstract representations. Depersonalizing is different from splitting, but often associated with it, as in borderline psychopathology, for example. Splitting is the manner in which two opposing attitudes toward an object are maintained and split off from one another temporarily in order to satisfy an instinctual demand. Splitting is sometimes represented in an actual split image with two distinctly different sides within the drawing. But actually, images such as these can also reflect a wide variety of conflicts in which splitting is, in fact, not employed as a means of dealing with the conflict. Furthermore, splitting may also be expressed in the representation of a single all-good or all-bad image with no representation of the split-off other side at all. Though it is difficult to recognize the defense of splitting in children's drawings, I have on occasion seen drawings by borderline children that graphically depict their own use of splitting. Defenses employed in the drawings of obsessive-compulsive children often include intellectualization, rationalization, and undoing. Rationalization, the use of rational explanations to avoid owning thoughts, feelings, and desires, may be evident in preferences for realistic forms and themes, over more imaginative ones, and also in efforts to fix the picture, to make them right. Undoing is a way of managing an impulse by expressing it and then doing something to reverse its impact or message. Undoing may also be reflected in efforts to fix the picture, but is further reflected in drawing forms and erasing them, drawing and undrawing, or drawing pictures and throwing them away, usually because they too accurately revealed the child's wishes or feelings. Anna Freud described a little girl who drew a world where, quote, the people had to eat their way through monstrous accumulations of pats of excrement arranged in rows. In addition to these drawings, Anna Freud reported, she made a series of most delicately colored pictures of flowers and gardens, which she painstakingly executed with much neatness and animation, while detailing to me her very dirty anal daydreams. The doing and undoing in these anecdotes is recognized first in the pats of excrement being made less offensive by being lined up in rows, and second in the dirty anal daydreams being illustrated with delicately colored flowers. While those with an obsessive-compulsive style inhibit with intellectualization, rationalization, and undoing, there are other ways to inhibit employed by a wide range of personality styles. Minimization, for example, is often recognized in the verbal therapies through the use of the term just, as in, I just had one drink, or I just pushed her. As a defense in children's drawings, we sometimes recognize minimization in the preference for drawing tiny figures. I recently saw a young man who was much taller than both his mother and his father, and he was about 20 years old, and at one point he did in fact draw a picture of everybody in his family doing something, as I had requested from him, and he became rather amused and started laughing. Why was that? Because he had represented himself as much smaller than both of his parents, when he knew full well that he was at least a head taller than both. Repression is a mode of managing threatening impulses by simply not allowing them into consciousness. It is evident in the use of realistic themes, conventional content, stylization, and in copying the drawings of other children. Repression is at work in the common representations of some girls who never seem to tire of drawing in a very stylized manner people, houses, flowers, and smiley faces. And in the common representations of some boys who similarly are driven to drawing, again in a very stylized manner, airplanes, cars, and motorcycles. Regardless of the content, stylization is often an indication of repression. Some children may be very proud of their ability to draw appealing, cartoon-like characters. In therapy, it often takes some time before their repression gives way and they begin to produce representations of more expressive, if not awkward figures, devoid of the previous emblematic style. In some circumstances, repression is evident not by what is in the scene, but by what is left out. This, of course, requires a deeper knowledge of the specific child and the analytic process in which he or she is engaged. In contrast to conventional and realistic images, drawn by those using repression and rationalization, there are others who draw wiggly forms of otherworldly creatures which may reflect their disdain for conventional thinking, their inability to participate in social conventions, and their preference for denial and fantasy. They avoid external threats, such as social interaction, by retreating into fantasy and drawing figures that meet their internal needs. While denial and fantasy is one of many unconscious efforts to not think about something, suppression is actually a conscious effort to not think about something in particular. It may be reflected in the overt refusal to draw, the use of stick figures, and the covering over of images with pencil or crayon. For example, a 5-year-old boy enrolled in a regular classroom was doing poorly socially and academically. He was enuretic and really quite disturbed when I first met him. At the beginning of our work together, he was often overwhelmed by his flooding impulses. He drew pictures and told stories about Spider-Man in his hideout, which he represented as a triangle. And he depicted all sorts of waters and fires that were constantly invading Spider-Man's hideout. And as they did, he had to draw circles around them. He called them circle webs. He feverishly described the way Spider-Man threw a circle web around each of the masses of invading forces until they had all been successfully dealt with, and leaving this boy quite thoroughly out of breath. The little 5-year-old boy, and he would actually be sweating. He was so anxious and so exhausted with his efforts to put the circle webs around all of these invading forces. His efforts at suppression, putting protective circles around the danger, were obviously only marginally successful. And in fact, one could easily see how he had used therapy to deal with something he needed to deal with, but in another way didn't want to deal with at all. A common experience of many patients in therapy. In Erik Erikson's 1937 paper, Configurations in Play, Clinical Notes, he reports the case of an 8-year-old boy, Jay, whom he saw in psychoanalytic treatment. He says, quote, his first drawing pictured a woman with some forms enlarged so as to represent large buttocks. In violent streaks, he covered her with brown paint, unquote. In this anecdote, we can see the way the defense of suppression both conceals the anal concerns, that is, covers the large buttocks, while at the same time revealing all the feces about which Jay was so concerned. Another boy, a patient of mine, became so distressed with the battlefield scene that was taking place on his paper that he was at last only able to frantically suppress his impulses by covering each incoming plane that he was drawing on it with a massive brown crayon that he referred to as Dookie and Caca. While suppression is a conscious effort to not think about something, denial is an unconscious effort to manage external threats by, in a sense, saying they don't exist. Denial may be expressed in ways similar to suppression and repression, but may also be expressed in minimizations, absent figures, and graphic boundaries that effectively reduce the threat of the figures in the drawings. Depressed patients commonly suppress and repress their anger and then redirect it toward themselves. We call this turning against the self or the intrapunitive stance. It is a way of managing aggressive impulses and the fear of retribution by attacking oneself in the name of the other. It is commonly used defensive strategy of depressives and others with low self-esteem. We see turning against the self in frankly suicidal themes, in scenes in which the protagonist meets with obstacles and succumbs to them, and in images that are declared ugly and covered over with additional markings. Turning against the self is also reflected in some refusals to draw, in harsh self-criticisms of one's ability to draw, in declarations that the pictures are ugly, and in tearing up the pictures or throwing them away. While turning against the self is a way of managing one's own aggressive impulses, we often see patients turning away from the world outside or their impulses within by regressing. Regression is the tendency to deal with threatening stimuli in manners associated with earlier levels of development. It can be recognized in defensive strategies such as infantile themes, decreasing levels of pictorial complexity, and other forms of infantile behavior, including acting out. Regression in the service of the ego, on the other hand, is evident in the child who can allow himself or herself to enter into the drawing activity and let go enough to be able to say, as one child once said to me with genuine enchantment, "I wonder what I'm going to draw today." When regressing in the service of the ego, the child loosens some defenses and in doing so draws on the well springs of the unconscious to awaken conflicts and seek resolutions in creative new syntheses through the metaphors expressed in drawings and the stories told about those drawings, of course in relation to the analyst or therapist. Acting out is the tendency to unconsciously go into action and live out problematic dynamics rather than seeking solutions through cognitive and affective channels. We often say that people act out rather than remember, but with impulsive children, their acting out may simply be a problem of never learning to canalize the experience through cognitive and affective channels to begin with. Acting out is obvious in the child that tests the limits of the therapy situation. In these circumstances, the child may disown his or her superego and provoke the therapist to fulfill this role. But we can also recognize subtler forms of acting out in the child that splashes color across the paper, uses broad brush strokes in drawing, breaks the crayons, cannot confine the drawing to the edge of the page, and routinely ends up marking the table or floor where he or she is drawing. Or when the child cannot plan the drawing well enough and seems to always need a second or third piece of paper taped onto the first to contain all that is being expressed. Enlarged images, including those that may be too big for the page, may reflect a tendency toward acting out and grandiosity, but similarly may be reaction formations against feelings of inadequacy. But then again, reaction formations can take many forms, including the minimizations referred to earlier. Reaction formation, the warding off of forbidden wishes by taking the opposite attitude or moving in the exact opposite direction, may also be revealed in the details of the stories children tell about their drawings. As mentioned previously, in the discussion on defenses in play, when acting out, the pretend status of the play is lost, and the child's impulses seek direct gratification in actions that stop the imaginative play and become dangerous, disruptive, or inappropriate. This naturally applies to children's drawings as well, where acting out forecloses the pretend status of the play, of the drawing, and in doing so, avoids opening the Pandora's box of suppressed, repressed, or split-off material. But the pretend status of drawing and playing can also be lost in other ways. If we set up a dichotomy between the real and the imaginary, the imaginal or purely fantastic, the pretend might be said to be the optimal potential space between the two, where play and creative drawing happens. If the child is sunk in the imaginal or purely fantastic, with little or no relation to reality, he or she may rely heavily on defenses such as denial and fantasy, or abstraction at the psychotic level. Using these strategies to the extreme, the child obliterates the conflict-ridden world, or even attempts to assert omnipotent control over it by making drawings imbued with magic. On the other hand, those that cleave to denial and rationalization seem to glorify the real and the realistic in an attempt at representing a desolate, perfect world devoid of people, animals, emotions, and other sorts of things too difficult for them to deal with. They demonstrate a depressive pseudo-maturity that covers their inability to pretend and their omnipotent but brittle attitude toward their creative efforts and human relationships. Their realistic representations, like hard fetishes, cap the perverse or frankly psychotic sentiments embedded in and beneath the surface. This is quite common in children who have a particularly strong obsessive-compulsive style. More recently, I've encountered children like this who initially appear extremely creative until I discovered they were representing and recounting quite reliably every single detail of a veritable pantheon of video game superheroes and their respective strengths and abilities. It looked like they were so creative, but all of a sudden you discover they had just internalized some computer game reality. While my presentation, covering a great deal of material in a short space, may seem formulaic, I do not intend this material to be used as a set of simple formulae, but rather as a set of observations that may attune the therapist to recognizing the defenses in children's drawings. The reader will have noticed that some strategies are associated with more than one defense, and that other defenses are only revealed or elaborated in the stories children tell about their drawings. Furthermore, in many circumstances, the defensive strategies are recognized not as individual defenses, but as constellations of defenses. Nonetheless, the clinical implication is that the therapist needs to interpret or manage the defenses to allow the child to move, for example, from acting out restriction of the ego and inhibition up to intellectualization, rationalization, and repression, and onto humor, regression in the service of the ego, and sublimation in order to express and come to terms with the unconscious fantasies behind the conflicts and deficits that brought the child to therapy in the first place. As noted earlier, Merton Gill called our attention to the ways in which defenses have both impulse and defense aspects. And Roy Schaefer noted that defenses are not simply wardings off, renunciations, and negative assertions, but are also implementations, gratifications, and positive assertions. Their comments were made in the 1960s, but more than 30 years earlier, Melanie Klein, in a discussion of ego restriction in children, wrote, quote, "Moreover, such activities as monotonous, obsessive drawing, building, sewing, or making things, especially when we obtain few associations to them, seem to offer no means of approach to the life of the imagination. But we need only recall the examples of Greta and Egon, two cases that she presented, to remind ourselves that even activities and talk so completely without fantasy as these do open the way to the unconscious if we do not merely regard them as expressions of resistance, but treat them as true material." The following case is illustrative of what we have been addressing here today. Carl was a timid and somewhat isolated 7-year-old boy who was academically functioning below his ability in school. In our first session, I invited him to draw absolutely anything he wanted to draw. He was impressed by the explicit openness of the offer, as though it opened additional opportunities for him. He drew a multicolored roller coaster track with 2 roller coaster cars. The roller coaster was drawn like an S on its side. It descended from the upper left corner, dipped at the bottom, rose up in the middle again, peaked, and then descended in the lower right-hand corner. His ability to sublimate was evident from the first session, but he was also plagued by his own use of projection, which made it practically impossible for him to allow me to watch while he drew. I didn't interpret his projecting, but rather managed it by simply averting my gaze until he was ready to show me what he had drawn. In the second session, he drew 2 more roller coasters with the tracks in pretty much the same position on the page. These roller coasters, however, were more hastily drawn and monochromatic, suggesting an inhibition or restriction of the ego, which seemed to indicate that he was straining under the pressure of his roller coaster-like impulses. Then he drew a third picture, a fight between Godzilla and King Kong. The end of Godzilla's tail was in the upper left corner. Following the contour of its body, the tail slopes down into his back and then reascends up to his neck and head at the top and middle of the page. The line of action then descends again in a blast of fire, emerging from his mouth onto King Kong below. In other words, the swirling impulses previously metaphorized in the impersonal S-shaped roller coaster had been differentiated into a conflict between 2 animate forces in battle, Godzilla and King Kong. In the third session, he drew 3 pictures, another S-shaped roller coaster and a rocket, and then 3 multicolored rectangular boxes said to be containing monsters. He was making efforts to manage, that is, suppress, his impulses, metaphorized as monsters in boxes, and was clearly straining in the effort. We could see in this drawing his monstrous impulses trying to get out, while his defensive boxes tried to hold them in. Again, I made no interpretation to the defense or the impulse directly, but rather interpreted within the metaphor. I said to him simply, "Those are big, strong monsters you have in those boxes. It looks like they want out, and you want to keep them inside." Now, I met Carl twice a week in a school setting. He was always glad to see me. He would refer to me as Mr. Daniels, walk toward me with a smile on his face, and take my hand. Then together we would walk down the hall to what we called our picture time room. Walking down the hall, I was always quite aware of his soft, warm hand resting in mine and the deep affection he showed toward me. As soon as we arrived in the room, he would sit at the table and demand that I give him a piece of paper, insist that I give him his crayons, tell me to shut up, growl at me, get exasperated with me over nothing at all, and draw his pictures with great intensity. If I asked about his picture before he was ready to discuss it, he would become enraged and tell me to shut up. When he was ready, he would tell me his story, often with great irritation. At the end of our session, we would put the crayons away, file the picture with his name and date on the back, leave our picture time room, and then, leaving our picture time room, he would take my hand affectionately again, lean gently into me, and together we would return to his class, where he would tenderly say goodbye to me until our next meeting. I contained his love and aggression without acting on it or taking it personally, and in doing so helped him to talk about that which was difficult to talk about and draw that which was difficult to depict. Then one day, his rage was absolutely peaking. so much that he was barely able to organize himself enough to draw. He growled at me, slashed at the paper with his crayon, and in one jab, his crayon ripped a hole in the paper. Thus we have acting out. He continued to slash at it, and when I asked him about his picture, he said, quote, "No, yucky and junky and booty and poo-poo and pee-pee and boo-boo, Andrew." Andrew was a friend of his. Then he angrily demanded another piece of paper. I gave him the paper, and to both of our surprise, an aesthetically pleasing image emerged before our eyes. A house with colorful Christmas lights, a garage, a truck, clouds, snow and stars. His mood shifted from rage to enchantment. He said, quote, "It's raining outside. It's green snow coming down. I like this picture. The snow is going to be everywhere. A house with 2 garages. I'm going to have to decorate it. It's Christmas time. I want it to shine at night. If I do it real bright, I'll bet it will shine at night. Mr. Daniel's house, that's your truck. That's your snow. That's your clouds. That's your light bulbs. These your 2 garages. That's your door. That's your star. That's your star up here. Those 2 stars is your stars." Embedded in this drawing were forms similar to those seen in the roller coasters and figures of Godzilla and King Kong that he had drawn previously, but in this drawing were reorganized aesthetically and personalized in the name of the transference. Without suggesting an instant cure or even a long-lasting shift, we can say that we had witnessed a movement from representation of the inanimate to the animate, to the personal, and from restriction of the ego, projection and suppression, and acting out to sublimation and regression in the service of the ego. Conclusion. In Freudian dream interpretation, we seek to identify the drive derivatives, but we also attend to the mechanisms of revealing and concealing the drives, the secondary elaboration, and the manner in which the dream is told. In the interpretation of children's drawings, there is often a tendency to focus on only the drive derivatives, rather than recognizing the child's graphic representations, recognizing that the child's graphic representations are, just as in the reporting of dreams, a compromise between the drive derivatives and the defenses used to manage them. This means that the image is never simply a symbol with a meaning, but that the image itself is both drive derivative and defense in one. We listen for what the adult patient is not saying in the way the patient speaks and the way the patient does not speak. Similarly, we need to be able to look for what is not represented in the child's drawings in the way the drawing is drawn and the way the drawing is not drawn. In doing so, we orient ourselves to helping the child draw what is difficult to draw and say what is difficult to say. When we forget the defensive component of a dream image or a drawn image, we are more inclined to interpret the drawing simply as a drive derivative. While such interpretations are often illuminating, after a while these interpretations to the body metaphor tend to fall with a dull thud. Furthermore, when the image explicitly represents bodily-based wishes, we often find it difficult to interpret beyond the manifest content. But with an awareness of the defensive component of the image, nothing is taken at face value, not even the explicit representation of bodily desires. And when the image explicitly represents these bodily wishes, we can often further elaborate it by recognizing the defensive nature of the presentation. And when the image explicitly presents the bodily wishes, we can often further elaborate it by recognizing the defensive nature of its presentation and by recognizing the additional metaphors embedded in the story describing it. Thus, what we need in order to interpret a child's drawing is an understanding of the theory of infantile sexuality and the symbolic function. the ability to recognize drive derivatives, and the ability to recognize defenses in drawings, and the ability to play with metaphor. Thank you.